Number one, the topic of the sexual abuse of minors, of children, is a crime. It is a grievous sin. We must be concerned with the victims and the havoc that this causes in the lives of victims. The church in Canada, particularly, was one of the first churches to deal with this head-on in the early 90s. For those of you, some of you may not have been born then, I realize this young crowd, but in the early 90s, when I was young, I still am young, but I was younger then, we had a situation in this country called Mount Cashel, and not an orphanage, but a boarding school run by the Irish Christian Brothers in Newfoundland. And that became the epicenter of the sexual abuse by religious of young people who were going to this school. And it went like wildfire. And in fact, the court hearings aired on television that summer. It was sort of like the Watergate hearings in the United States where I grew up, where you watch this every day on television. It was the sport of the summer. In response to that, the Canadian bishops moved very forcefully, issuing a document called From Pain to Hope. And therefore, in the early 90s, long before the crisis of Boston and everything else, the Canadian bishops instituted policies and procedures on how to address this evil, how to address this sickness, this crime. The story continued on, and I'll skip over a couple years, and we arrive in the year 2002, January. To be precise, January the 6th. I'll never forget waking up that morning. We were in the throes of planning World Youth Day. We already had the first explosion on September the 11th of 2001, and living those months of September until December saying, how are we ever going to host this event? And security and everything else. And I remember January the 6th, Boston, the epicenter of the crisis in the United States. And the revelations which were exposed by the Boston Globe and the terrible things that had happened in that archdiocese, and then began like a snowball across the United States where victims started coming forward. They had been minors who had grown up and they recognized and they saw the hurt and they were able to come forward and speak about what had happened to them at the hands of priests, at the hands of brothers, at the hands of sisters, at the hands of ministers of religion who should have had their first goal, the protection and the care of those entrusted to them. And so the United States bishops then went into full throttle in addressing this situation. They called a very famous meeting that year in Dallas, the Dallas meeting, and the Dallas Convention, the Dallas Agreements, and instituted all kinds of policies. One strike, you're out, some people call it. And we've been dealing with this ever since in the church and in religious congregations. The problems come about when we realize that there are different arguments in how we try to explain this thing away. For example, one of the things that we'll often say to the press is, yes, but we didn't know then what we know now. Or, yes, but it was only a one-time thing. Or it was only one person. Or we have many people in the church, well-meaning people, good people, who don't like to read these things, and they'll lash out at the press. I'll lash out at the press in a few moments, but let me just finish this line. Though the press is evil, the Toronto Star, don't buy the Globe and Mail, don't listen to this, because they're making all these stories up. And then you have people in the Vatican, believe it or not, who come out with outlandish theories of these stories. This is only a North American problem. It's because people were born in the United States. Or it's because Obama is president. Or it's because of this. Or it's because of libertarian or free thought. And it's because of abortion taking place in Canada or whatever. That's why these things happen. But we're not addressing the actual issue. None of those excuses help us to get to the actual issue that a child, the most precious gift entrusted to us, has been taken advantage of and abused by someone who should have been protecting, someone who was in a position of authority, someone who was in a position of caring for this person. Therefore, the response of the church in each of these cases, there's only one way to address this: to acknowledge the fact that a grave crime has been committed, to care for the person who has been hurt, to make sure that that person, many times an adult, sometimes 30 and 40 years later, is offered the proper help, financial assistance if there's psychiatric or psychological scars, if the person lost a job, because this causes havoc in people's lives, and that we go forward like this, in blatant honesty, in sincerity, and in humility. Because what's happening through all of these terrible things is we are being brought to our knees, and we are being purified and humbled. We are being stripped of any last vestiges of prestige or a privilege that may have belonged to our lot, especially as priests here. And we have to start over again. It's as simple as that. I've had to deal with both victims and perpetrators, those who have been abused, men and women, and I've had to deal with the priest and the religious who has often taken advantage of someone. It is never an easy task. There are no easy answers. In fact, in many cases, there are simply gasps and tears, and to be with the person in the midst of that crisis, and to follow through. This is not a one-time deal. Oh yes, you'll be over it. Go to the psychiatrist for 3 months, see the psychologist for a year, and everything will be fine. It's not going to be fine. Because we have this thing in our being called memory, and we also bear scars. It is also possible for some people who have been abused or hurt to have gone through a process of reconciliation and healing, and they themselves become healers of others. And I've seen this many times, and it's actually quite moving to experience. We don't stand our ways condemning or explaining all this stuff away. We must stand together as the Catholic community to say that the sexual abuse of minors, of children, is an evil, it's a wretched thing. We have made grievous errors. But since we became aware of the crisis, no institution like the church has taken huge efforts to make sure that all of those who are working with young people, with the handicapped, with vulnerable people, go through training programs. They have police checks. We have adult awareness programs. We speak about this publicly like no other institution has done. In the United States alone, when the crisis hit in 2002, already 5 million people have gone through the training programs for working with children and with vulnerable people. 5 million people since 2002. Protocols are in place. All kinds of things happen to prevent this. Priests have workshops and study days. Bishops and archbishops review protocols in dioceses. Religious congregations take great efforts. But we must admit that many of the stories coming to light, and there'll be more, are stories from 40 and 50 years ago. The stories we're dealing with in my congregation, with the stories you'll see on Monday in the paper, they happened in the 1950s and the 1960s. That's before I wasn't even born yet. And certainly you people were the twinkle in God's eyes before I came around, okay? So we're dealing with stories, we're dealing with evil that is coming to light, and we're trying our best to respond to that now with charity, with clarity, and always to give people hope in the story. That is the key. These are terrible things. It's the drip, drip, drip every day in the paper. In my job, every day we get all the stories, all the reports. But I tell my staff and I tell myself, this is not what we are about. We're dealing with evil, we're dealing with sin, but we're going forward. That's the bottom line in all of this. Does sexual abuse of minors have a special place? Is it in the DNA of the priesthood? Absolutely not. But what we can say is for some reasons, combination of reasons, those who were in privileged positions of care and of authority over others, priests, teachers, Boy Scout leaders, or whatever, somehow this became a way to either justify or to hide very evil things that were taking place. That will not happen again. That cannot happen again. That's why. And people will say, well, you know, They don't go after lawyers, they don't go after doctors, they don't go after married teachers or whatever when this happens. Why are they going after the priesthood? Well, let me tell you my take on that. What it's helped me to understand is no matter what people say, priests are still held in great esteem by people, by Catholics and by non-Catholics. Whether we like it or not, and I'm speaking here personally, whether we like it or not, people see us and recognize who we are, and they expect a certain kind of behavior, of moral behavior, of integrity, and of just living from us. Whether we like it or not, ordinary people will still say, you're a man of the cloth or a man of God. A lot of people, no, I'm just Tom, I'm just sitting around drinking. No, we are marked and we are special and we have special responsibilities and vows that we must fulfill. And therefore, people hold us accountable for those. For that reason, I really believe the only positive glimmer that can come out of why the church has been so scrutinized is that that humanity today still respects the priesthood. They still respect ministers of religion. And if anything, we will come out of this better people for what we're going through.